Online for July 24th. My name is Ted Hearn, Managing Editor of Broadband Breakfast. I'm standing in for Drew Clark this week because Drew's away for a few days, spending some quality time with his family. For those of you who are not familiar with Broadband Breakfast, we are a news and an event community focused around better broadband, better lives. We report every day on broadband build-out in America and the impact it is having on people's lives. This Broadband Breakfast Live Online is part of the weekly live stream we have every Wednesday, where we invite experts and industry leaders to talk about topics related to broadband, and it's online only. We're also very excited to announce an in-person event this September, the Digital Infrastructure Investment Summit. This is our 6th annual DII Summit. This year, we're putting a focus on open access, a topic we've been covering for more than a decade. Early bird tickets are available now. Just go to broadbandbreakfast.com and click on the Digital Infrastructure tab to register. I also want to give a special shout out to the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast. We would not be able to do this free programming every week without the support of Utopia Fiber, Comcast, SmartWave Technologies, Ookla, Wesco, COS System, Institute for Local Self-Reliance, Community Broadband Networks Initiative, the California Emerging Technology Fund, G-Fiber, Broadband Now, Tarana Wireless, WISPA, Broadband Without Boundaries, and NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Thank you to our sponsors. With that, let's turn to today's program. We're here to discuss the Universal Service Fund. The USF has been facing intense scrutiny in recent years, with growing calls for an overhaul of its contribution mechanism. Under the current system, this subsidy program helps rural and low-income families get online by imposing a fee on telecom companies' revenues. The recent decline in the contribution base and a significant shift to broadband connections have sparked heated debates about the relevance and effectiveness of this legacy framework, particularly with the expiration of the Affordable Connectivity Program. To discuss these issues and more, please welcome Greg Geist, Chief Policy Officer, Vernonburg Group, and Chair of the Affordable Broadband Campaign, Pamela Arluck, Vice President and Associate General Counsel, NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, Lynn Follansby, Vice President, Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships, US Telecom, and Lindsay Stern, Attorney and Policy Manager for Encompass. Greg, please take a few minutes to start us off with your take on some of these issues.
Great. Hey, thanks, Ted, and thanks to Broadband Breakfast for having me. I appreciate it. I think I know everybody on this panel, but for folks that don't know me, I have spent literally the last 25 years of my career talking about the Universal Service Fund, and it is a passion project that I have a lot of love for, and I think it's an historic commitment that our nation has made to everyone in our country to ensure that they have access to affordable, reliable communication services. In 1996, Congress codified the Universal Service Programs that the FCC had operated for decades before that. And in that commitment, what Congress said is that the FCC needs to run a program to ensure universal service for rural consumers, for schools and libraries, the kids and patrons of those institutions, for rural healthcare clinics to make certain that folks living in those communities can get access to telehealth and telemedicine to literally help save lives, and the Lifeline program, which the FCC itself had started in 1980s under the Reagan administration to ensure that low-income families could afford connectivity. Fast forward to today, and we still have those same programs existing, largely in the same way that they existed back then. Now, they've been modernized to some extent to account for broadband, which is great. It is the network of our era. But more has got to be done. And, I know we want to talk about contribution reform, but before we get there, I really think we also want to talk about visioning. And so, how do we make certain that these programs are working today for the communities that they were supposed to work for back when they were originally envisioned? Because times have changed and needs have changed. And so modifying the distribution side, I think, helps prove the case for why we need to fix the contribution side, because there's a lot that we need to do, that we simply can't do because our contribution system is broken. So I look forward to the great conversation here. I will just say these are some of the greatest minds in this area and the folks that are working hard to find consensus. So I'm excited to see Lynn, Pam, and Lindsay on this panel, because their organizations are fighting hard to figure this out as well. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Ted.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Pamela.
Hi, Ted. Thank you so much for having me on the panel. And thank you to my fellow panelists. I know everyone on the panel as well. My name is Pam Arlick. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Vice President and Associate General Counsel of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. We represent some of the largest cable operators in the country. And, I can start off by saying, I do, agree with Greg that I think when we're talking about universal service reform, we should start looking at distribution, how everything is distributed. Last year, the USF program spent about $8 billion. And I think the first thing we should do is look at, are we spending that money wisely? A lot of that money is just, spent on programs that were, that were set up a long time ago to fund certain communication services that people aren't really using anymore. So I totally agree that that's, sort of the first thing that we should look at. Our companies were big supporters of the ACP, we've always, cable companies have always provided low-cost options for our subscribers that were low income. And, unfortunately, Congress did not continue funding ACP, and we think that's really unfortunate. But what we don't think that we should do is actually tax these very people that we're trying to keep broadband affordable for. So, when we do think about contribution reform, we don't think that we should tax consumer broadband services. So, but I am looking forward to this discussion. It is so complicated, and should be a lot of really interesting perspectives on this panel.
Great. Thanks, Pam. Lynn.
Thanks, Ted, and thanks, Broadband Breakfast, for having me. I am Lynn Follensby and Vice President of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at US Telecom. And I too have been working on the Universal Service Fund since its inception, I'm proud to say, and it is, like Greg said, it's a passion project, right? We all know that this is such a wonderful program that provides access and affordability to consumers, and we want to keep it going. But it was created in 1996 when the universe of what the telecom and even internet ecosystem looked like at the time. So it does need some updating. We absolutely would agree with that sentiment. And I think it's important to know that the USF is critical for the deployment and maintenance of broadband networks. That's a key piece. So when we're thinking about distribution reform, while BEAD and other non-USF funding programs go a long way towards the deployment of getting broadband, getting that access to the highest cost and hardest to reach parts of the country, those programs don't address the cost of maintaining and operating broadband networks where that support is critical to keep those networks going. And Universal Service Fund is intended to close that gap. And this is even despite massive amounts of private investment that my members at US Telecom have made. So we need to make sure that that fund is sustainable and robust in a competitive marketplace so that going forward, not only do we get folks connected, but we can keep them connected. So, in light of that, thinking about how the networks have changed since their inception and that it was based on voice service at the time, we're now having increased demands on broadband capacity and speed due to streaming gaming and a lot of other uses of the networks that were not contemplated at that time. So we need to think about how do we reform the fund to keep up in the future of USF report that the commission recommended to Congress that they should provide the commission with some legislative tools to make sure that contribution reform can happen. And we support that. And we think that is the right way to go at this time. And we also agree with the commission's recommendation that the commission get clear authority to assess the revenues of services whose business models substantially depend on consumer business access to broadband. So that includes things like digital advertising, streaming services, app stores, just big tech in general. If we believe that if you include the universe of those entities that are benefiting from the network in the contribution system, you would have a wide enough base to not only make sure that the fund is sustainable for the future, but we could also provide a permanent home for the ACP, for the Affordable Connectivity Program, which will make sure that those low-income individuals will have access as well and be able to maintain that access. The affordability piece is a key component of the Universal Service Fund, which, as I mentioned at the top, is focused on not just access, but also affordability. So I look forward to further discussion about how we get there with all of these great folks who know a lot about this area.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. Appreciate it. Okay, Lindsay.
Great. Thanks, Ted. And thanks so much for having me to Broadband Breakfast. And it's a real honor to be on this panel with these fellow panelists. They're all wonderful. And we've definitely all been in the same room. So it's nice to be on the same panel together today. So for those who don't know me, my name is Lindsay Stern. I'm an attorney and policy manager here at Encompass. And Encompass is the Internet and Competitive Networks Association. So we represent competitive network providers and the leading online content and tech companies. And we advocate for competition in the marketplace. So we've been active for years in the USF reform discussion because USF is a really important program to our members. And that's both on the distribution funding side that we've heard about and also on the contribution side. So on the distribution side, most of our members participate in the USF, mostly in the E-rate and rural healthcare programs. And there seems to be some agreement already on this panel, which is great. So we also support reviewing the distribution programs and streamlining any USF programs if possible, in order to make sure that the USF dollars are going where it's truly needed. And especially in light of all the funding coming out of the Infrastructure Act, we think that it's really important to constantly be reviewing these programs, making sure it's going where there's truly need. And we think that this could relieve some pressure on the rising contribution factor as well. And then on the contribution side, our members also pay into USF. And Encompass actually started getting involved in the USF discussion years ago, about 6 years ago, when our competitive providers were telling us that it got increasingly hard to explain to their customers why there was an increasing and fluctuating additional fee on their monthly telecom bills. And the factor is now just over 34%, and it's on trend to hit 40% soon, which is unsustainable and is only going to get worse. So we're very concerned that the USF is in a real crisis. And so we have supported a solution to expand the contribution base to include broadband internet access service revenues, which often is referred to as bias revenues. And we've largely relied on the USF forward report by USF expert Carol Maddy, which recommends expanding the base to include bias revenues and which would decrease the contribution factor to less than 4%. And there's a lot of support for this. We're part of a USF Forward Coalition, which is a group of over 340 organizations that all agree that this is the best solution. So this is a real solution with a ton of support that can be implemented now. And Encompass also put out an economic report through the Brattle Group, which shows that from an economic approach, why assessing bias revenues is the least market distortionary option that we have right now. So overall, USF is really important to us and our members, but the current system is really unsustainable. And so I think this whole conversation is about the importance of USF and making sure it's sustainable into the future. So looking forward to the discussion. Thanks again for having me, Ted.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. Let's start on Capitol Hill. There's a working group. Can we talk about who's in the working group, what's on the agenda, and what's been accomplished? Greg, you want to start?
Sure. So there is this USF working group. It began in the Senate, and it is a bipartisan, bicameral group of members. Senator Lujan, Senator Thune, others, Representative Latta, Representative Matsui, and some others have come together to try to figure out what can we do to make 254, which is the statutory provision, Section 254 of the Communications Act. What can we do to make 254 more reflective of what we need today? How can we give the FCC what they asked for in their report to Congress, further direction from a legislative standpoint on what they might want to do? The status update is that group has been working hard to try to find some sort of a blueprint forward. They've circled around on some of the key concepts that they want to move forward on. They get an expansion of the contribution base. They provide the agency with the ability to sort of go through the process it has as an expert agency to develop a record on how they would go about doing these things. But it includes, for example, broadband revenue. It includes some sort of, I call them data services. I think it's a little cleaner as opposed to tech. On the data service side, there are, and under the current system, people contribute based on special access, private line, and those types of data intensive things that people buy are akin to other things like cloud services. And so Congress is looking at how you might apply the fee to those. And also, I think there's an idea that maybe look at digital advertising as part of that as well. But they also do some distribution stuff, but I'll stop at the contribution side.
Okay. Anyone else jump in?
If I can just provide a little bit more background, but that was really helpful, Greg, just of kind of how we got here. So in that Future of USF report that the FCC put out, I guess now a year or so ago, because all of this money has come from the Infrastructure Act, about $65 billion, there's now this big question of, does universal service need to change? Can we streamline any of the programs like BEAD and high cost, ACP and Lifeline? And so the working group has really been tasked, like Greg said, with looking at the distribution side of things and looking up how can we, are there any changes that need to be made to the universal service? And then also on the contribution side, the FCC asked for guidance here of how it should and could move forward. So it's interesting because it is the bicameral bipartisan group. And it has a big job ahead of it, looking at the distribution and the contribution side here. And last August, they did ask for comments from the public. And I know Encompass, and I'm sure everyone on this panel filed those as well. So they were, and I'm sure still are, reviewing those comments. A lot was put into the record already last summer. So they have a big task ahead of them.
Great, thanks. Pam, Lynn?
Well, I would just say, they are working super hard. I know I think they've gotten so far as to have some kind of version of some legislative text, but they have not shared it with the public yet. We're all anxiously awaiting to see what they've come up with. There's so many elements, the Universal Service Fund's been around for a long time, and, there's contributions and distributions, and there's a lot of things that Section 254 touches. So I always like to say that it's quite something to unravel. So I think that they have been discovering that in their process of trying to write text. And I'm hoping that, we're certainly advocating that they release it for the world to see sooner rather than later. It's very, very important. And we don't want them to lose momentum on this project.
Mm-hmm. Pam, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, we've been involved in the working group as well. They've been really, I know they've been working hard, on all of these issues. And I'll just echo what everyone else said. We're, looking forward to seeing, what they come up with.
Mm-hmm. Well, my question would be, can Universal Service Fund reform, and let's call it broadening the contribution base, pass Congress without bringing the ACP into the USF?
I mean, I think one of the clearest missions of universal service has been addressing affordability. And so, ACP was a remarkable program in what it did. It allowed whatever the provider is, it didn't have the gating of Section 214 to enroll if the FCC would approve them. It allowed consumers a meaningful subsidy, $30 a month, to connect to the broadband plan of their choice. So they didn't have to buy a specific product. They could buy any product and use that $30 towards that. And as a result of that, 23 million households ultimately subscribed, and it was just a true success. But it was also a pilot program of sorts. And what it proved to us was that the annual appropriations process is in no way an effective way to ensure that low-income families can have broadband service. No way can we leave them to the whims of an annual appropriations process. And so I think, Ted, the answer to your question is really, how can we not do USF reform and not find a way to fit something that looks like and behaves like an ACP into that program? Now, it doesn't have to be the exact same thing, but we should learn from those lessons that we did get and then figure out a way to make the USF program look more like it so that it can be responsive to low-income families.
And just, I'd like to add on the ACP, I think it's really important to remember that the ACP was created in the Infrastructure Act to essentially go hand in hand with the BEAD program, right? So we're on the verge of spending 42 plus billion dollars to get broadband, ideally, finally, to every single American. But in a lot of those areas, particularly high cost areas, low income folks need some help with that. ACP essentially ran out of money before we were able to get to the BEAD piece. So it's really critical that something, as Greg said, that whether it's exactly the ACP or something like it that's reformed in some way, but that needs to be continued. It's absolutely essential to ensure the success of the BEAD program and also to ensure that those low-income folks can have a meaningful subsidy. So, as Greg said, the appropriation process has not proven out as a way to sustain the ACP. So it needs a permanent and sustainable and reliable home. And we certainly think that the USF provides that opportunity.
And I'll just jump in, Ted. We, Encompass is a great supporter of the ACP, and I think Lynn laid out those reasons really well for us too. This helps the BEAD and the deployment case as well, because if you're building the networks, you also want people to afford them. And so we think it's a really great program. And the appropriations process has unfortunately been really difficult, but we have been part of a large coalition that is still hoping that we can fund the ACP, at least in the short term, through appropriations. We totally recognize that in the future, the USF could be a really good possible permanent home for the ACP, but we're still really nervous that the contribution factor is too high to put the ACP into the USF as it is. And so we think that in the short term, we're hoping for appropriations and that we really need contribution reform first before we can put this huge program into the USF. But we are big supporters of the ACP as well.
Yeah, I think everyone agrees that the ACP was a really successful program, and it's really unfortunate that Congress let it expire. So, we think Congress needs to step up and provide some funding for it. We don't think, universal service reform, that's really complicated. If Congress wants ACP to happen again, I think it would have to provide some appropriated funding for it first. But it really is unfortunate that it expired though, because I think that creates a difficult situation with customers. We don't want to put customers on a plan that could expire again. So that's concerning as well.
Great, interesting. The USF spent $8.1 billion in 2023, according to USAC's annual report. Adding the ACP to the USF's 4-program menu would double USF spending in the first year. That assumes 23 million households in the program, in the ACP program, and no change to the IIJA's eligibility criteria. Is that a political problem to double the USF fund in the first year?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Which is why I think that we've always said it has to go hand in hand with contribution reform. You can't have it any other way. I mean, there's a twofold problem. There's the contribution issue in existence currently, right? The factor is high. But then there's also this need for this permanent home. And I think this is where the opportunity to really take a broader look at who contributes. The chairwoman herself wrote a letter to Senator Lujan earlier this year that laid out sort of the math, right? And that, you know, if you tried to add the ACP in, it would blow up the Universal Service Fund. But with contributions reform, we could do two things. We could lower the contribution factor significantly, and we could fund ACP ideally in perpetuity.
And I'll just add, I think that's exactly right. As it exists today, I mean, you could add ACP. You could call Lifeline and change it, whatever, technically. But it would be unsustainable, as Lindsay pointed out and as Lynn pointed out. So you have to do the two things together. And contribution reform needs to occur before you can do the affordability reform that's necessary. And I will say it is necessary. The Affordable Broadband Campaign, which I'm chair of, we've been working hard to sort of lay the groundwork for that. We're open to all of these ideas on how you fix it. We're trying not to be dogmatic about it, but there are some practical solutions in the near term. There are some longer term solutions that we can work towards, but we think we need to have all those solutions sort of on the table, at least talking about them. So there are no boogeymen, so that we can have these conversations and try to come to some sort of compromise to fix this. But anyway, so yeah, I think they go hand in hand.
Lindsay?
Yeah, just to explain a bit about why I think we're also concerned with the rising factor, because we do this all the time and we always talk about how the factor is so high. But from a real world perspective, we're talking about a over 34.4% fee on your monthly telecom bill. So this is just a huge problem for consumers, and especially business customers who are buying a tremendous amount of telecom. They are getting really frustrated and don't want to be paying this, already what their bill is, and then on top of that, an additional 34% fee. And so the problem here is that we're seeing a lot of gamesmanship and a lot of skewing of the market, because if you're a customer and you have a 34% fee, you're going to try to find a different service that is a similar service but isn't assessed under USF. And so there's been a real skewing of the market in order to avoid the fee. And we've even heard that some customers have just said that they're not going to be paying their providers their fee anymore. And so it's hard because typically providers do pass on the fee, their USF fee, to their customers. That's pretty much the practice in the industry. And so I think I just wanted to shed some light on why we keep talking about the increased factor and on consumers, and why it's a really serious problem.
But I do want to point out that for actual like residential consumers, the fee really isn't all that high, because it is 34%, but it's only on a small percent of your bill. So the average consumer is only paying like $1.50 to $2.50 a month. But if bias, as Lindsay was suggesting, were assessed, the chairwoman has said that, broadband bills would go up to, they would increase $3.59 to $17.96. That's the range. So that could potentially be a really huge increase for consumers. So that's something that we're concerned about as well.
Interesting. All right. I was going to
could I just say a quick response to that, if you don't mind?
Sure.
So I just wanted to point to Encompass. We put out that economic report that I talked about before, the Brattle report, which talks about the economic benefits of expanding the base to include broadband. And I know we haven't fully gotten to that discussion yet, but I did want to point out, because it's an important point, like I said, that the economists have said it's the least distortionary option to the market. But they've also said that many consumers are actually likely to save money because if we expand the base to include broadband and the factor goes down to less than 4%, then the fee on the current telecom portion of your bill, the voice service will also go down. So there's about 40 million Americans, for example, that still have a home phone service. All of them will see a huge decrease on their home voice phone bill if the factor is now less than 4%. And they also have shown that if you're a broadband only family, there will likely be an increase of about $2, which is not a tremendous amount. So there is economic research that does show the opposite, that many consumers will save money. So I just wanted to make sure that point was said.
Great. It's a great point. Thanks, Lindsay. In the net neutrality order that I believe was adopted in April and released in May, the FCC had an opportunity to address USF contribution reform. Greg, I know you took issue with what the FCC did there. Can you describe what happened and why you think the FCC's action was insufficient?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. What the FCC did was they said that they would exercise their forbearance authority, which the statute gives them, to say if they find it's in the public interest and some other factors, that they cannot exercise authority they otherwise have to exercise. And so in this case, under Section 254D, the Congress directed the Commission to have every carrier contribute to a universal service system that the Commission itself designed. Right? So that's the setup. In 2015, the Commission said, hey, we need to look into this a lot further. And there's a federal state joint board that's looking into what the impact of broadband contributing to USF would be. And so the time's not right. So we're going to temporarily forbear from exercising authority to do that. Fast forward to 2024, the FCC basically said, hey, we did this in 2015. We think it's appropriate to do it again. And so we will once again exercise our forbearance authority. And because we have now reclassified broadband as a telecommunications service, and therefore providers of it are carriers, and they should contribute on the service, we're going to forbear from exercising that authority right now until such time as we can sort of figure things out, and maybe Congress can figure things out. What the Affordable Broadband Campaign raised was that you did not need to go straight to assessment of revenues if you were to make the conclusion that, yes, in fact, broadband is a telecommunications service. What we were pointing out is that in the past, mobile, VoIP, other services, broadband itself, had all been part of a separate proceeding to determine whether and how they should contribute to USF. And that's important, whether they should and how they would. And so what we were saying is you do not need to forbear, you simply need to refer it to another proceeding, and we can address that in due time on a specific record, as we did with mobile, as we did with VoIP, so that we understand exactly how it would contribute if it does contribute. And the FCC chose not to do that. So the Affordable Broadband Campaign and a couple of our stakeholders that are involved in that, we submitted a petition for reconsideration and asked the FCC to do that. We don't expect the FCC to act on that petition. In fact, we think it's pretty unlikely, but it is a step to preserve a legal step in the future at the FCC to have them reconsider that decision should they decide it's warranted. Mm-hmm. That's what we did.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to address what the FCC did in the net neutrality order vis-a-vis USF reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the commission was trying to do was to, and I think Greg touched on this too, is recognize that they know this needs to happen, right? But I think that the chairwoman was signaling that she wants Congress to tell her how to do it, and that she wanted to hold out for broader reform. I think lots of folks have said, assess bias right away. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But, she's done the numbers herself, and she doesn't think that bias only is going to solve the problem. So, and we would agree with that. So I think that she wanted to sort of toss the ball over to Congress and say, hey, let's look at this from a bigger perspective. Let's look at it in a broader way. And that's always been our position, that we should keep it open to all players in the internet ecosystem. And the way these things work, sometimes you only get one bite at the apple. So it's we think it's a good idea to look at the whole thing as a big picture rather than stay narrowly focused on one aspect.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with Lynn. I think she also kind of recognized that this really wasn't necessarily the right venue to kind of take on this issue. This is a huge issue that kind of needs its own proceeding and its own record.
I think we're similar to where Greg was on this, because we can agree that maybe this wasn't the place for it, but by forbearing, it really took it off the table. But we weren't saying that it should be implemented right away. Like Greg said, we could have moved this to a different proceeding and put it on the table there. The market is really different today than it was when the FCC did its forbearance last time. For one thing, the factor is much higher. The issue is not in front of the federal state joint board. There's a lot of things that are different now than last time. And so we were just disappointed by this approach and think that we could have addressed both things here without taking USF reform off the table.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just quickly say, I think, the saving grace is that the FCC was very clear in the order itself to say, while we're exercising this authority in this instance, we do envision it as a temporary sort of authority, and that as circumstances change, we fully intend to act accordingly. And so to Lindsay's point, if the factor keeps going up and Congress fails to act, then maybe the FCC will have to do what it has the authority to do. But I think giving them time was everybody's intention. It's just, we thought there was a procedurally more sound way to go about it than where the FCC landed.
Good. Great, thanks. I wanted to ask a question about state USF programs. In the net neutrality order, apparently there's a footnote that says the FCC has preempted states from using their USF programs to assess broadband ISP revenue. Is that accurate? And can you discuss a little bit about how extensively states have been collecting broadband revenue for their USF programs? Lynn, do you want to just jump in?
Well, some states have, some don't. And I think what the FCC was doing here in this footnote was just frankly confirming essentially the status quo for contributions based on the provision of bias and consistent with the earlier open internet order. So I don't think it was really a huge change. Some states have found different ways to do USF. I know there's some states that do it based on connections and a variety of other things, but I think that state universal service programs should really be looked at separately from this overall federal program.
Interesting. Anyone else want to talk about the state situation?
I just want to point out that the preemption was also in the 2015 order as well. So this wasn't like really a new thing.
And I would just add that, the statute itself envisions this sort of sharing of responsibilities between the federal and the state, but it also says states can't do anything that's inconsistent with what the FCC does. And so it always created this tension point. But as Pam points out, it's from the 2015 order. They carried it forward in the 2024 decision. But I think it underscores the importance of finding answers to these questions, because our partners at the state level are unable to help, and their programs are under similar stress. And so the sooner we can resolve this at the federal level, the better we can make it for the states as well.
Great. Interesting. States haven't really commented on this footnote, but I guess maybe it stems from Pamela's point that it had been in operation since 2015. But meanwhile, the cities are relentless at the FCC over the mixed use rule, which prevents them from assessing a cable broadband revenue as part of their right-of-way fee. Chairwoman Rosenworcel, disputes that the USF is coming on, and I think the FCC is on record disputing that the USF is under financial duress. A, and B, she wrote this letter to, I think, Senator Lujan in January, saying that assessing bias revenue for the USF would raise bills from 5 to whatever the range was. I think Pam had it, and she's backed up by this by Free Press. So are her rate shock concerns genuine and accurate?
I'll jump in. I think, as Lindsay pointed out, there are a lot of studies that say a lot of different things, and depending on how you try to set the framing, you can come out with dramatically different results. The beauty of an FCC is that they can run a process and a proceeding where they can find these answers, but unfortunately they've stepped off that field for now with this forbearance decision. So, but there are competing studies out there. Some say it would have little to no impact. Others say it could have a big impact. I think we ultimately need to find that as best we can, find the answer. I've done my own back of the envelope stuff on this, and I can tell you, as Lindsay pointed out, there are a lot of families right now that pay based on their mobile, their local, and yes, their long distance or VoIP bill. They pay a substantial amount at 34%. Those numbers all go down. The broadband only families are the only ones that I think have are positively impacted, because when you bring in the cost of services and apply a factor that is a much lower factor, this stuff can kind of wash out. And there's, people are willing to pay for these services, and they are willing to pay their universal service fee to have them. And so I think it's a much more complex situation than just a bill goes up or a bill goes down. And so a fuller, robust discussion, I think, is warranted. And hopefully we can have that over the next few months as the USF working group and the FCC looks to figure out what the future looks like.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Yeah, and just to chime in there, I think something that was a bit frustrating to see for us in that letter is that there was no, we couldn't see how they got their calculations, right? So it would be really helpful for us and for the public if the FCC was able to break down those numbers further and, essentially show us their work of how they got those numbers. Because like Greg said, there are other studies out there that show something different. I mentioned the Brattle report, which shows that many consumers will likely save money because the fee on voice goes down, and that any increase would be $2. So this was an economic report, and it's hard for us to understand the discrepancies with the FCC letter. And they're having these concerns about potential price increases if you bring broadband into the base. But it's also important to remember that the FCC can always exempt low-income customers. So they currently do that for Lifeline, and if there is something like an ACP, they can always exempt low-income customers from paying in if a $2 is too much for a customer or a family. Talking about these different studies, there's also the NTCA study, which shows that assessing broadband would not materially impact consumer broadband adoption or retention. So it's hard because there are these competing studies out there that say customers, if you expand the base to include broadband, customers will save money, and if they don't, it'll be maybe $2. So again, it would be helpful to see where the FCC exactly got those numbers.
Yeah, I mean, so the FCC also cited some studies in their Future of Universal Service report, where they also, cite studies saying that, if you include broadband in the base, the prices for consumers will go up. And I just don't see how, just when you do a back of the envelope calculation, I just don't see how they don't go up. And clearly, the chairwoman was concerned about it. I'm not saying that, I understand that some people want to do that, but I think we just have to be honest, that if you do that, the prices for broadband consumers will go up. And I think that's, it is a problem when you're trying to encourage adoption of these services and keep them affordable, to then impose additional fees on them. So I think that's something that really does concern us.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and I want to add on here, I think that, yes, I think that there's, you can see numbers that would say voice customers, obviously, if the contribution factor goes down, the rate that anybody who's currently paying goes down, right? Anybody who's not currently paying that has to pay, that goes up. But it's really moving deck chairs around, right? And the greater problem is, what's the base of revenue that is supporting this? Even if you're adding bias, like, we have to look to the future and also look to what does our internet ecosystem, what does our telecom internet ecosystem look like now, right? It's not a voice-based system. It's much broader than that. And that's why, we think that you need to look beyond just this world of voice and bias and VoIP. And like, there are so many others in our world now, that the services that used to be that folks communicated with was the phone, right? Now it's, all kinds of texting, DMing, I won't name any names of companies, but there are so many methods by which folks communicate. And so we need to look broader, right? And think about who benefits, who sends all this traffic on the networks that are, my members are building and Pam's members are building. Who's doing that, right? It's not just the folks that are providing the internet service. So I think it's, rather than rearranging the deck chairs and have a temporary solution and risk going off the cliff yet again, given that broadband prices have, continued to stay steady or decline, we could end up with the same situation in another 10, 15, 20 years. We don't want that. I think we need to look broader and make the base bigger so that we have a really, truly sustainable over the long-term program.
Mhm. Interesting. Okay. One thing I wanted to say is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've read that when a telecommunications carrier is dunned by the USF for contributions, the telecom company doesn't have to pass those USF contributions along to the consumer. Many do, but apparently there's some that don't. What I wanted to ask is that if big tech, however defined, has to contribute to USF, what's going to happen? Am I going to get a bill from Google each month? Is there going to be an assessment on my Microsoft 360 account or my Google Drive account with a USF line item? How would big tech be assessed, and if they wanted to collect it from me and other consumers, how would they go about it, you suppose?
Ted, I can jump in here because Encompass is, like I said, a big supporter of expanding the base to include broadband and not tech. And I think that your question right there is one of the biggest reasons to show why assessing tech is not a good idea, because there is no real proposal out there and it's really unclear what that would look like. So to your point, there is a good chance that, instead of assessing at the bias connection, doing one fee, and making it easy, that if you start going after the tech companies, that consumers could start seeing an increased price on various platforms and various services. So I think it's unknown, and it's a possibility, but that consumers could start seeing prices rise on various services. But I also think it's important to point out that these streaming and online tech and online content companies today don't receive or request USF funding. So the USF mainly today supports broadband networks, and the broadband providers, understandably so, are the ones that are directly financially benefiting from the USF. So it would be odd for tech companies to be paying into the program when they're not receiving any of the benefits. And the economic report, the Brattle report that I discussed earlier, does show that including tech would distort the market and harm competition, because going after certain companies and treating them differently than their competitors is not a good plan and can really skew the market. So, I mean, just as a quick example, if we started, let's say, charging streamers to pay into USF, but not their competitors like cable or broadcast companies, it could really skew the video market, and we can continue to see the same gamesmanship we're seeing today of people trying to get a similar product that's not assessed in order to avoid the fee. So, tech is already investing heavily in the networks, but USF has always been about connecting to the network and not focusing on what's riding over the network. And so, to your point, I think there's a lot of confusion of what it would look like. And one of the benefits of expanding it to include broadband is that it's easy, and we know how to do it, and it would be a one-time fee. So,
Lindsay,
Yeah.
let me just jump in. Would you protest an ISP that tried to recover its USF contributions from big techs giants?
what do you mean? Like, what would that?
Well, Comcast goes to Netflix, Comcast goes to Google and says, we have to kick into USF right now. We think you should help us pay that bill.
Yeah, well, like I said, so I don't think that the USF contribution base should be expanded to include these companies. But to your point, I just wanted to point out that, I mean, these companies are already paying for their services to be delivered, just like any other company. And they're already paying into USF. For example, when they buy these services, they're paying into USF just like anyone else is. So they are still contributing in that sense. We just don't think that it should be expanded to go after these companies.
Interesting. Anyone
But-
else want to jump in on that? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Pam? Pam?
Go,
Or-
Pam, I'll let you go first and then I'll go.
I know this is where we'll have the biggest disagreement, so.
We have 9 minutes, so it can't be that long of a battle.
Yeah.
Just quickly, I mean, that is something, so your question about like, how would it work? How would it be assessed? I mean, that's something that if tech would be, if tech would be included in the base, I mean, that is something that the USF working group is looking at. And that is kind of Congress's job would be to figure that out. Just because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean that it couldn't be done. So, they would have to structure legislation to assess it and to figure that out. And that is something that they are working on.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that the USF working group is looking at specific lines of business. Like, look, we're not talking about assessing, every single dollar that the big tech companies make. We're talking about lines of business that are, have an impact, right, on the networks. And, our members have been paying into USF and investing, billions of dollars to build the networks. And they are forced, due to the amount of traffic across the networks, to increase their capacity for their consumers by, just sometimes tenfold, right, in a year's time. And those costs are really, really tough. And so part of what USF, we have to remember, the USF is intended to make sure that parts of the country that would not otherwise have access to broadband get service, right? The high cost fund is intended to support rural markets where there would otherwise be a market failure. In other words, without that support, the network would not exist. So if the network is able to be deployed and maintained, it provides these big tech companies with a lot more customers, right? So the argument that they're not benefiting from the network, and I'm sure there is some investment in the network, but the primary investment is done by my members and Pam's members. And the increased costs on an annual basis are quite something. So it's, again, this goes back to why it's so important that the USF Working Group in Congress figure out what the right blend of all of this is. But we are not living in the world that we were in 1996. And so we need everybody to come to the table and figure this out so that all Americans can be connected. We can close the digital divide. Folks can afford their broadband. This is something that is just so important and really needs to be focused on as we enter sort of a new era.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. In the remaining time, I wanted to put aside some time to discuss the following topic. Does anyone have any thoughts on the impact of the Supreme Court's recent decision in Loper Bright v. Raymundo on USF reform?
I mean, I think
So-
that, oh, sorry.
Go, Pam.
No, I was just saying, I think that probably makes the FCC probably more cautious and more looking toward Congress to get clear direction
Mhm.
on both contribution reform and distribution reform.
I would,
So
I would say that under-
your point
Right.
there would be that if the commission decided to assess bias, it could run into a Loper-Bright problem.
Right, correct.
I think it just needs to be a very express and explicit direction from Congress. That's how you meet the test. It has to
Yeah.
be explicit.
Mhm.
All right, now I'll differ. I think under 254D, Congress said every telecommunication carrier shall contribute based on a mechanism designed by the commission. It says other providers of telecommunications may contribute as the commission decides. There is clearly a structure by which Congress has directed the FCC to design this thing. Then it goes on to say, and here's what we want you to design it to fund. And that funding must be in a certain way. So it has the rural high cost program. It has the schools and libraries program. It has the rural healthcare clinic. In fact, if you were to look at a provision in statute, not that Telecom Act is any, as Scalia has famously said, it's no model of clarity. But if you look at 254 and you look at how the programs are laid out and what the distribution side looks like while still leaving the FCC some authority and flexibility to do what it needs to do to meet those needs and evolve those needs, I think the FCC is on pretty sound ground. Now, that's not to say that the better course isn't for the USF working group to achieve what it needs to achieve, but it is to say that in the event that we can't get that outcome, the FCC does have an ability to sort of push the envelope and say, you know what, this statute's pretty damn well written in this regard, and we can do what we need to do here.
Mhm.
And Ted, yeah, I agree with Greg on that. I think it's clear from the statute that the FCC can do this, that they have the authority to do it, and that they have the responsibility to make a sustainable and predictable universal service fund. And so, you know, the USF working group was formed because the FCC's Future of USF report asked for guidance, but, you know, we would argue that it didn't actually need that guidance. It could have gone forward and started assessing broadband revenues for the Universal Service Fund, and that its authority to do so is anchored in the statute. So don't get as nervous that it would be an issue under the new precedent.
Mhm. Okay. Well, we just have a couple of minutes left. I just wanted to make a couple observations here. You know, Senator Ted Cruz has said expanding the base without distribution reform puts the cart before the horse. Spending reform must precede revenue reform. Senator Mark Kelly, who has been floated as a potential running mate of Vice President Harris, he introduced a bill that would require big tech and broadband ISPs to contribute to USF. John Fetterman supports including big tech in the contribution base and including ACP in the USF. AT&T CEO John Stankey has been vocal in recent weeks about including big tech in the contribution base. Brendan Carr, at the FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, has been vocal about adding big tech, but I believe he has acknowledged that that's going to be a chore for Congress. And thanks a lot for addressing the Loper-Bright issue. And I just wanted to do, in the remaining minute, I just wanted to do kind of a lightning round. Did you, if you, the issue of USF reform, does it happen in 2024, 2025? What's your best guess? And please be brief. Lindsay,
I'll go.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is that this is an after the election thing that will get taken up in the next Congress. So I would say, as much as I would love for it to happen this year, I don't think it's going to happen this year. I think next year is a potential possibility. It just there's a lot of unknowns once we get past November.
Great, Greg.
2025.
Lindsay.
I'll agree with that. I think there's too much going on at the FCC and Congress to have it be this year.
Pamela.
I agree with everyone. Yeah, too much going on this year.
All right, very good. Well, we've reached the end of our hour. I'd like to thank our all-star panel for the great discussion. And I'd like to invite the audience to come back next Wednesday for another edition of BBLO. And the topic will be, it's all about costs, junk fees, and affordable connectivity. See you next week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.